So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce everyone on stage in alphabetical order. There are no favorites. And each brings such a strong and insightful perspective to the exhibition, to contemporary sculptural practice and beyond. So I'm just so honored and thrilled to have them all as a part of this program. And Hasti, who is here from MCA, who has done all of the behind-the-scenes work, I just want to thank you for everything you've done. Raise your hand. And Krista also for helping to get one more opportunity to sell more books from the exhibition. I'm so grateful. So, okay, without further ado, sitting to my left is Maria Elena Pusick. She is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Colorado, Denver, where she teaches courses on modern and contemporary art. Her recent publications include the books Pinup Girls, Feminism, Sexuality, Popular Culture, and Extraordinary Craft and Contemporary Art, which I personally referenced a lot in my research for the exhibition Tara Donovan Fieldwork. And the forthcoming anthology, A Companion to Feminist Art. She has also contributed writing to numerous international anthologies, exhibition catalogs, and scholarly journals, and worked as an independent curator and as a curatorial assistant at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in California. Her current book project, Art of Noise, explores the ties between contemporary feminist art and popular music. Thank you for being here. Artist and professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, Kim Dickey has had solo shows in New York, Los Angeles, Kansas City, and Denver, and has participated in invitationals in Australia, Denmark, France, Germany, Japan, Korea, Sweden, Taiwan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. I'm breathless. American galleries that have shown her work include Garth Clark, Jack Tilton, Pierogi, Thomas Healy, Sherry Leedy, Fool Gallery, and White Columns, and she's currently represented by Robichon Gallery in Denver. And last but not least, Jenny Sorkin is an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art. Her current book project, Skin, Grid, Sin, Cloth at the Body's Margins, great title, examines contemporary textile-based sculpture and installation during the 1980s and 90s. She's published widely as an art critic and currently serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Modern Craft. She has been a visiting critic at institutions across the country, such as the Cranbrook Academy of Art, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Yale School of the Arts. So please join me in welcoming them. Can you all hear me okay on my mic? We're good? Okay. And then, why don't you, yeah.
So when Nora asked us to be part of this panel, which she wanted to be very freewheeling and open, which is fantastic, she also asked us to come up with a kind of short statement about what we might want to talk about, which I didn't know we'd be reading to you today. I thought this was just for Nora, but I'm happy to read it. It's not secret or terrible. But it does give you a sense of kind of where I came from as far as looking at the show, thinking about it from my own perspective. And since she introduced us with my own current research project in mind, I guess I went to some places, both as an educator and as a scholar, that maybe could shoot us off into some directions beyond just Donovan's work or site specificity or what have you. So I wrote, while I recognize and appreciate the relevance of minimalist and post-minimalist artists like Robert Morris, Ada Haas, and Robert Smithson to Tara Donovan, and thinkers like Rosalind Krauss, who helped articulate the expanded field, quote unquote, for visual art that they cleared, I have to admit that what I like best about Donovan's work isn't so much its site specificity as its material specificity. Not that she returns to the modernist idea of materiality, fetishized by Rosalind Krauss's mentor, Clement Greenberg, but rather there's a trickster magic to the way that her work always comes back to the pop cultural specificity of her materials. I love how Jenny Sorkin, in her contribution to the Fieldwork catalog, foregrounds the, quote, effusive materiality, end quote, of Donovan's work. What I most admire in Donovan's work is the way it additionally rejects this heroic self-regard from which many artists and much scholarship of these aforementioned movements often suffer. Her media are unremarkable materials, culled from big box home improvement, restaurant supply, and wholesale stores, that simultaneously undermine and add to audiences' breathless responses to how she wittily manipulates them. As such, I'm interested in perhaps talking about the comedy of Donovan's work and that of her influences, as well as its glam rock DIY theatricality.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Dickey. Thank you for the invitation. Nora, I'm very honored to be on the stage with some of my most revered colleagues in the field of the arts. So I am, as an artist on the panel, I took the liberty to, rather than to think theoretically in some ways about her work, to inhabit the work in the way that I need to inhabit it, both having walked through the exhibition, but also engaging in the title, particularly, where that took me. So I love the title, Fieldwork. I'm transported to the hay fields behind my house growing up, the ones I used to wander through on my way to nowhere in particular, leaving a flattened trail in the tall grass behind me. The hay would be cut just before the weather changed, sometimes into the wee hours of the night as we raced against a coming storm. The millions and billions of blades were collected and stacked into beautiful fragrant cubes and stacked once again until teetering on rickety hay carts to buildings with conveyor belts to be stacked once again in the attics of barns, then to the corners of stalls and paddocks. And we would climb over this newly built architecture of grass to throw it down stall doors once again or to rest on it, and sometimes fall asleep where in your dreams you could find yourself once more in the fields. With each installation of Tara Donovan's exhibition at MCA, a similar journey could be imagined and felt in the weight and accumulation of her works. Seemingly inconsequential materials of our domestic lives, straws, index cards, tar paper, create massive landscapes and transport us outside again. They form glaciers and mountains, icy walls and crystalline formations. But where has the ocean gone that formed these rifts? Was it sipped away through all these countless straws? Was this land denuded and buried by the written history that replaced it? Did the house collapse under the protective weight of its roofing? It is a magical inversion that only art can form. You are sent here or there, slowly or suddenly moved by the illusions of the work, mixed with your past and present situation. Art converts material, whether it be memory or paper, peat moss or time, into meaning, the transitory and generic into the cited and specific. Field work is provocative too, suggesting there's work to do in our fields, in our environment, in our world, in our communities. There are so many fields worth surveying, worth cultivating, worth stewarding, and art's landscape is especially fragile and fraught, yet enduring and fertile. But here we can also see it as brittle and frozen. If nothing else, Tara Donovan's fieldwork has certainly shown us the result of our processes, whether manufactured or organic or visionary, its potentials and possibilities. But what does her work intimate about our future? Are we to be buried by what we make and consume? Are we too racing against a storm in our furious production to satisfy a hunger we don't have? If so, she's showing us the beautiful end and a glimpse of all that we will be left with. So that's where my sort of reverie of experience took me in sort of inhabiting her world. And I had a question at the end of it that kept haunting me, which is, what does human scale mean? It used to be something when we'd say, oh, at the scale of the human, it would be this sort of warmth and intimate space. And now I think that that term is also so enormous. It's a scary term now to me, so that's where I was left with. Sorry. Next.
Thank you, Kim and Maria and Nora. It's really nice to be here. I've been spending a lot of time in my head thinking about the 80s and the 90s, and I really think that Tara's work comes out of those installation artists are from the 80s and the 90s are really progenitors for Tara's work, and so installation in American art really gets going, I would say, in that sort of those decades, but largely the 90s and into the 2000s, and that's when she would have been in graduate school and looking at work, and is a kind of inheritor of these early installation traditions to some degree. So I'm sorry this is on my phone, but it is a real statement. Though she's an artist invested in tactility, Donovan has specifically avoided the intensive corporeality invoked by a range of pioneering artists such as Janine Antoni, Robert Gober, Ann Hamilton, and Kiki Smith. Donovan has put forth a program of sculptural abstraction intent on minimizing the viewer's individuality. Donovan's work casts aside feelings. There is no human condition to address, no fragility of the body, no interiority, no affect. By shifting focus away from internal bodily processes and emotions, she hones in on an assertive spatialization that offers a profound out-of-body experience. Donovan's installations are nearly all monochromatic, designed to harness attention away from the precise forms of the individual object repeated and toward an overall aesthetics of perception. It is the infinite modularity of the material that contributes to the illusionism produced per each large-scale sculpture. Shifting scales, the perception of the infinite, the visual trickery of light distributing shadow upon an uneven surface, the integration of sculpture with its architectural object as an architectonic site. These are just some of the ways in which her work predisposes viewers to engage beyond the body and, moreover, the self.
Well, I think we clearly have a lot of different directions we will be going in this afternoon. And
I don't think your mic is on.
Can you guys hear me?
Now.
Okay, now it's better.
It's gotten buried under
Oh, it's got buried under the snood. Okay, let me know if at any point it's not as clear. So there are some key kind of, let's say, like broad areas that I'd like us to dig a little deeper into. Some things that have come out, I think, like this idea of material specificity, and the idea of pleasure in her work, how we experience and find pleasure from her work. The relationship of her installations, sculpture, and works on paper to nature and the natural world. This issue of scale, I think I'm really excited to kind of dig into a little bit more. And the relationship to the body, I think, is a component of that, Jenny, that you're alluding to. So what I'd like to do is kind of ask you guys, let's start with material specificity, as Maria kind of brought out. Something that I have always kind of pushed Tara on is her use of what we refer to as mundane, neutral materials. And what I'm curious is your opinions on, to what extent are they neutral, and to what extent do you find that they are they apolitical or not? And also, Maria, to kind of go a little bit further in some of the questions you were posing, like, to what extent are these works very much specific to our time, or are they kind of ahistorical? Meaning, could her works only be produced right now, or is there a timelessness kind of to some of them?
I feel like Jenny said something really smart in her catalog essay when she talked about, when she contrasted what Donovan does with her materials with something like Agnes Dennis and her Wheatfield. That whereas you could argue that they're both artists who deal with scale and specificity and installation and sensuous materials, that Donovan's are really like anti-natural. That maybe you're a good person to start, it seems, in that regard.
I find Tara's work difficult in the sense that there are no feelings in it, and that it really is an anti-body kind of experience that I think she's going for, that it's about not having an individual feeling and instead being overwhelmed by the materiality. And I would argue that I think it's pleasurable to view, but I don't think the work is pleasurable to make, at least in my sensibility. I wouldn't want to make it. It's really repetitive. It's repetitive construction. It's using often accrual or accumulation of very small parts to get giant parts. So, endless amounts of buttons or tar paper or slinkies or index cards or straws. And the monochromatic thing, I think, would drive me nuts too. That everything is this. You only get the kind of opticality of the effect of color when all these materials are together, and it's because there's a kind of transparency that's being drawn out, and then it somehow bends, the convex of your eye, and you end up seeing a weird after effect, like yellow or purple or blue, and it's very slight. And it changes based on the light that pours into the gallery, which I really like. And I think that all of that as an accrual, it rejects the individual altogether, and it makes you feel very small in comparison. And so I think that is the relationship that Maria, you're talking about with kind of post-minimalism or Morris or Krauss or any of those people, but that it's. I think for me, her work is difficult in that sense that it doesn't have the body. It's absent the body, except in making you feel like a dwarfed small person in relation to all this material.
But what do you make of how she uses things that are created in support of our body? Like a drinking straw only exists so that we can drink. Like the relation that we have as users of these materials.
And we have tactile relationships to these things. Absolutely. And it's funny because, I find her work very satisfying as someone who definitely has the OCD gene. because I actually kind of revel in the idea of this repetitive, nonstop thing that her work does. And I mean, for example, when I feel like the happiest job I had when I was in graduate school was I was working in the slide library. There were still slide libraries. We were right on the cusp of the digital age for art history. And I was just never happier than when I was in the slide library doing these really repetitive tasks like taping, putting the reflective tape on the film or typing literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of labels. And so when I see her work, I find it very pleasurable, but in a way for the same reasons that for the same things Jenny sees in it, which is in the way in which it reduces you from this big infinite human thing to this small task-oriented cog, which I understand a bit of that kind of, maybe it's a Catholic thing. Because I just got back from Rome with my family, where I'd been before, with students, teaching students, and I was going back to a lot of these churches, and as a kid who grew up really Catholic school kid, I understand that kind of appeal of turning oneself over to something bigger. But of course in the Catholic Church, especially these Baroque churches in Rome, it is a deeply humanistic, Counter-Reformation submission, which Donovan's work is not. But maybe that's the conduit the interface is these unnatural, mass-produced, oftentimes as Jenny points out in her catalog, not sustainable materials, but that we have some sort of actual intimate relationship with or knowledge of.
Yeah, it's the question you were asking about sort of the neutrality or, are these materials neutral or mundane? I think I don't think there is anything that can be truly neutral. I mean, I think we immediately, even the most raw material, we connect to our physical relationship with it, our history with it, or it's evocative character. I think that's sort of what I was riffing on. The sort of idea of what journey is suggested by the material, but then also by its accumulation and the implied process. So, and there is this aspect of humor that by using these things that are, a slinky and tangling them. I mean, this is a toy material that, I think all of us have an experience of like, maybe we have 10 minutes with a slinky in our, and then it's done.
If we have more than 10 minutes, it's because you're a parent trying to untangle it.
Yeah. And so there's this sort of giving up to the material in that construction that, sort of weave it, tangle it, make it into this sort of cloud that is almost like a drawing out of a cartoon of a kind of an explosion, right? So I definitely fell into the sort of, I think it's an easy trap, and so I was really struggling with this sort of, suggestive, apocalyptic aspect to the work, in the way that it is accumulated and then seems to sort of tower above us. And the tar paper is a very dark piece in particular. It's, it's elemental. It feels like it's an earth formation, and yet it's also the thing that we just keep layering on top of our roofs until they can't handle them anymore. At least my roof. And the older your building is, that's what happens. So I do feel that there's bodies implied in so many aspects of the materials, the sipping, the straw, and the process that they're implied, not just the body's connection to that material, but also the action as a result of using or engaging that material. While they are in fact, I think, distanced, and I agree, there's a remove from pleasure that they all engage, there is still so much that they suggest that take you on this sort of long kind of imaginative journey, which then I think flips back into, I think, as I say, to a very dark place at the end.
I think that what's really curious, I think that's a very nice meditation, and I think what's very, very curious when you ask about what's political, if these materials are political or apolitical, I think, for instance, like the drinking straw is now very politicized, and I don't think that she would have known that when she made the work. Nobody thought too much about drinking straws, and now they're a target because, they're a primary plastic that's going into the ocean and killing small protozoans and vertebrae, and when we see a green straw on the street, we know immediately there's a kind of corporate branding of a certain color now that we know that that's a Starbucks straw. And then, for instance, there's a whole, I live in a county in Santa Barbara County right on the ocean, in which there's a whole conversation. We have a lot of Asian American students on my campus and Chinese national students, and there's a lot of boba parlors and those boba straws that are extra big, where you can suck up the tapioca. There's been literally petitions going around campus as though this is something very important to the students. I'm only making fun slightly, but that you would have to retain your boba straw, and that's an important straw because it's part of the experience of the boba. And that if you ban those straws, you're not going to be able to drink those things anymore. Which I've never thought twice about. I don't like them, but lots of people do. And so the idea of the drinking straw as some sort of politicized. Agency. Yeah, it has agency. That's an exactly great term. Kim is saying it has agency, and I don't think that would have. I think if Tara knew that was going to happen to the straw, she would have refrained from using it.
I totally agree, and I mean we would.
I think you have to talk into the microphone now. Just give up
I'm just
that
gonna. Okay.
Just Maria, hand it over.
I think I can move.
Okay.
Thank you. I think that I wonder if she would have used the work that we're referring to is called Haze, and it was originally first created in 2003 when no one thought twice about a drinking straw, to Jenny's point. And I don't know that she would have scrutinized it the way she has now. If she was starting with it today. I've asked her in the past, would you ever consider working with a material that is explicitly or overtly, symbolic, politically charged in some way? And she said, no. She said, that's not. She said, I don't want to give people a particular way or particular line of or particular approach to my work. They can come at it from any way and from any place, And it's partly why she doesn't title her works anymore. She doesn't want to encourage a interpretation of any of her work. She wants it to be open enough to include any kind of response. And which I completely understand, but I just, I think, Kim, the point that you're raising is really intriguing, because just like there's no neutral space in which to show art, is there any neutral material with which to make art anymore? I mean, everything has a kind of history to it. Tar paper is like the most industrially manufactured material that exists. And yet, when it's installed, through her vision and realized through her incredibly hard work, she sat on that work for 4.5 days to make it here. And I think in Denver, it's like one of the smallest versions of it ever. So, that work, she's all in physically. It feels like it's something that you would find, in some very kind of natural terrain, volcanic environment. Yeah. or like volcanic, lava flow or something. And so how do we get there? Like, how do we get to the natural? Why do we go from knowing that it's tar paper, and even if you don't know that it's tar paper, you know that it's not an organic material when you are confronted by this work transplanted in a gallery. Like, that it's not organically made. So how do we get there so quickly in terms of our kind of visceral response? Like, this looks like something that feels like, that takes me to a completely different environment.
Well, I just want to clarify that she wants us to know the material and to have an immediate recognition of this material. This is not a material that we know, but it's transformed in such a way that we have no idea. Maybe the only one that I would suggest in her exhibition where at first you think, I don't have a daily interaction with mylar, but that's probably the one that's sort of the most the least recognizable as a material in our daily lives. But almost all the others, I'm assuming, and we assume, that the meaning of that material is absolutely to impact our understanding of this to be a catalyst, if not to understanding this construction, right? So, and to go to your point, I often try and give this essentially trick assignment to my undergrads, which is to go and make something meaningless. It's an impossible project. Good luck. So, interestingly, I wonder if she isn't sort of also perhaps maybe happy that, you've had this conversation, that there are other layers that the straw takes on now, and particularly in lieu of the way they take on this role as an environmental sort of agent, and clearly for ill, not for good, but that adds to this sort of kind of rich layering that is not only in the material, in the way the material presents itself, but also obviously in the material's evocative nature. So I think she's a process artist. I just want to go back to that for a second, because I think there's also this really interesting aspect to her work, which is I think of her more like Kusama. And if you look at those, 65-foot paintings that she did, well, there's only one and it doesn't exist, I think, any longer, of little loops that she painted in this infinity net, in this process of creating this enormous curtain landscape. So what is that? What is that need? What is that about?
I want to sort of bounce off that with a question actually for you, Kim, as an artist and as a ceramic artist. I know that's not exclusively what you work in, but it's probably what you're best known for working in. Looking at Tara Donovan's work, which is, mostly inorganic, right, materials. How does it feel for you, either as something close to or really different than the way that you work with clay? And I mean, the way you literally work with earth. And of course, you have to manipulate it when you're firing it and glazing it, and sometimes getting into toxic areas yourself. But do you feel like like a kinship with the way that Donovan works, or do you feel like it's just a whole other thing?
No, I definitely, I get it. I do understand the sort of, there's a point at which, especially in working with multiples, there's a point at which this is no longer fun. This is just pure labor. But it is still, it's at the service of some extraordinary...
those leaf shapes that you make that accumulate in your work.
Yeah. There are people in this audience who could agree with this problem, but who've helped me with this problem. You know, I don't see it as different in the sense that I also don't necessarily see some of these materials that she's working with as inorganic. It's sort of, now the whole notion of materiality, I think, is being thrown up into the air, because I just recently read this incredible book where he talks, Stuff Matters. He talks about the way in which concrete is now embedded with bacteria, so that when it's self-healing concrete, so when it cracks, the air moisture that gets in there wakes up the little bacteria that's been embedded, and the starch that has also been put in is the food, and then the bacteria eat the starch and then poop out a nice little self-healing, calcine that just fills the crack. And I thought, oh my God, that whole question you ask your kids, you distinguish for your children what's alive and what's dead. This is the tree alive, is the ground dead? Yes, the ground is dead, the rock is dead, this tree is alive. It's not, forget that. It's all alive. We're all alive, everything's alive, screw it. So I actually just really don't have a sort of, this material, and the way I work with it is so vastly different than this material. It's all touched by many, 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 many hands, manipulated in the same, kind of way in space. And I mean, I see it as all sort of excellent fodder for constructing a place that we've never inhabited and yet somehow need to. And so, but I am interested in that sort of impetus, so sort of where are we being located, what are we inhabiting? So this whole notion of installation art is, what is absolutely central to installation art is that you have to physically engage it by entering it. It is a truly immersive, interactive, somewhat interactive, but immersive experience to understand it. And where does it take you? So that's sort of where I'm curious.
Jenny, you brought up the, sorry, now I'm moderating. I'm like, I have so many questions for the people. You brought up the 80s and 90s installation art. What specifically, kind of riffing off of Kim, do you feel like we still see of that, in particular, that era, or those artists in Donovan's work?
So I think that for me, I reproduced in my catalog essay an image, an early piece of Ann Hamilton's called Privation and Excesses that has always obsessed me. It's this huge, large rectangle. It's like her earliest big installation piece. It's from '89, before the term installation was really in full use. Nobody really knew if it was a sculpture or not, but she was given at Cap Street Projects. It was an alternative space in San Francisco in a warehouse. And she was given $7,000 to work with, and she went and changed the $7,000 into all pennies, and she put them all down on the floor and made waves of them, and she doused the waves of copper pennies in honey. And then she had in the back room these sheep that were penned up, and you could smell them. And then there was a person on the side, because Ann Hamilton often has a performer in the space, sort of performing some sort of anxious labor. And she had these little mortars and pestles with the performer that was grinding teeth and pennies. And of course that doesn't grind very easily, so you could hear this noise, and it was, I didn't see the installation, I'm too young to have seen it, but I've seen it in reproduction, and it's always sort of obsessed me. And so those materials are very different to me than what Tara Donovan is doing. And so I felt like and yet there's still this sort of same attraction to minimalism. It's a large rectangle, but covering the copper in, drenching it in honey and having sheep in the space and having all of your senses sort of blown out in one space where you can smell the kind of sickly sweet honey and you can smell animal feces and you can hear this grinding sound, and I find that sort of like the idea of it very overwhelming and overstimulating. And so when I talked to Tara about, did you look at Anne Hamilton? And she said, oh yeah, I loved Anne Hamilton. I loved her, and then at some point I didn't love her anymore. And I said, why didn't you love this work anymore? And she said, because there was so much emotion in it, and I felt like I needed to move away from, I always admire Anne Hamilton, be careful how you quote me, let's work on this, but it was sort of this idea of like, I realized at some point I didn't want to do this kind of emotional thing that makes you have feelings in the space. And so for me, that's one of the sort of key things, is that I think a lot of women, sculptors and installation artists, particularly from this early 90s period, like Antony and Hamilton and Kiki Smith especially, are working in sort of a layered, complex way of relational feelings and aesthetics and the body and disgust and abjection. And for me, that's what's hard about Tara and hard to work through Tara's aesthetic, is that it's shape and a little bit of color, and it's very spare and it's very removed, and you don't get to have feelings in the space except the ones you bring to it.
Exactly, and I think that's like such a key point, is except for what you bring to it, and that openness almost for the visitor or viewer to kind of have any kind of response physically or emotionally. That there's nothing prescribed is key for Tara as she thinks about her work. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, having now lived with it for 4 months, this is so like passe to say it, but I'm going to go on record. People find a lot of joy. A lot of joy, and it's like you're not supposed to feel that in contemporary art. Like it's almost like that's like, well, where's the rigor? Well, no, I think we can all agree the rigor is there, but instead of wrestling with some more complicated, confessional, self-expressive struggle, trauma, what have you. And not to belittle those concerns within art at all, but I think that to find joy and to have that joy be like really validated as you move through the space has been, I mean, to be honest, I don't know that I've ever installed an exhibition that has, because Kim's, yours certainly brought out joy, but it also was a lot, there was so many other things that kind of countered that almost. It's been so surprising because so many people of all backgrounds and all levels of familiarity with contemporary art, what they take away from it, and I'm generalizing of course, but a key takeaway has been this like absolute pleasure of experiencing it, which I guess kind of goes back to our earlier point where you're right, I don't think that there is a lot of pleasure in installing the tar paper or transplanted. She even said, she's like, oh, I'm like day 4. She's like, I forgot. She's like, I'm a little out of practice on this one, because it is long and arduous and repetitive, and it doesn't feel joyful sometimes in the making. I think what feels joyful for her, and this can maybe pick up a different thread for us to talk about, is when she's kind of in her laboratory phase, where she's finding a material that she thinks she might be able to work with, and she's trying to figure out how she's going to work with it. That part, I think, is really, I mean, frankly, I think it's fun.
Playful.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and the comedy of her work and the humor is what I'm obviously, as I mentioned, most drawn to. But I remember when you told me maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago that this show, you were putting together this show, that I was like, oh my God, her work is magical. And it really is.
I've never heard you talk about an artist's work in that way, too.
because I deal with really political artists and activist artists, and I mean, and I deal with pleasure as well, but it's oftentimes a very politicized pleasure that I write about and curate into my exhibitions. And I mean, even with the craft research that I've done, so much of it has been about craftivism and taking the pleasure and the sensuality of materials and transforming them into kind of like community building of a very particular and oftentimes activist sort. But yeah, Donovan's work is so alchemical almost in the way that it takes these ordinary things and transforms them in these shimmering and delightful, joyful, as you put it, ways that that it really is, I don't want to say unique in the contemporary art world, but I think what's unique about it is I wanted to say the delicacy of it, but now listening to, you know, Jenny and Kim talk about it, I think it isn't so much about delicacy as it is about a kind of reserve, maybe.
Like it's not
Yeah,
fragile.
right,
It's not fragile.
right. It is because it isn't.
Holding.
Right, but that it's reserved. Yeah, maybe not even withholding, because I feel like it's very open and it's very generous work. That it welcomes you to look at it in many different ways, but it does also ask that you not think about those sea turtles when you're looking at those straws too.
So
Kind of.
it's that pristine aspect that Jenny was talking about. There's remove, there's a distance in which you're engaging in work, and it's very pristine. And there's restraint. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that must be the term that is better than delicate. But also, something that I love about her work, and again, where I feel it really radically differs from her predecessors, is in its refusal to be heroic.
Wait a second, that tar paper piece you don't see as heroic?
No, not at all. I mean, I feel like in a way it's, I mean, maybe
Or
this is
the
just because I've done
Index
enough.
cards.
No, no, I mean, I feel like they're impressive, but they don't have the kind of self-regard that like a Sarah piece does.
I would
Really?
disagree, but that's okay.
I'm curious because
yeah.
I feel like there is the
Okay.
kind of like delicacy and the fragility of the materials that undermines the heroism of the piece. You don't see that? Which is funny because your work, Kim, is so, when it's big especially, is very formidable and very literally heavy.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess I would have to ask you what you mean by heroism, or like what's heroic? Like what constitutes that? Because I guess I'm curious.
I feel like with this kind of work, what I think about when I think about work that is heroic, that there is a kind of self-conscious self-regard about how important the materials and the artist conceiving it are. That even if it's, you know, and here I'm thinking about like, you know, even something that you could argue as mutable and relatively sensuous, like Robert Morris's felt sculptures, right? That there's still something about their scale and their relative heft
Right. Okay.
that
So it's in
that
the
demands
material.
that you take them really seriously, and that by extension you know that the artist is serious about what you're supposed to be getting from this.
Right.
That I feel is missing even from the more heavy materials like the tar paper piece, where I mean it almost looks like at first glance like construction paper, like a child's diorama, until you recognize like all of her work, what it is actually made out of, and then you know it transforms, or a different kind of awareness comes over you. But I feel like even with that piece and that material and that scale, that it doesn't, unlike let's say Sarah of that scale, doesn't want to kill you, doesn't threaten to kill you in as direct a way.
All right, so I wanted to ask Kim a question actually about this idea of
Poor Kim, she's right in between two art historians going, but wait.
this idea of when you work in clay, for instance, and you're making representational shapes or motifs from nature and layering them like feathers or leaves or shells, and Tara's work, which draws entirely on already previously made material, things that you find at the store, things that you can buy at Costco, like batches of styrofoam cups. does that seem to be, as a maker invested in clay, perhaps, is that shortcutting when you start from such a different place? Like you start from scratch, Tara Donovan starts from Costco. What is that? I mean, now it's all leveled in the playing field, but what does it mean to choose to work from scratch?
Let's see. I mean, I think it's such a tricky question because all material, all starting places is found object in some ways. I guess clay is probably one of the few things that doesn't enclose form. It doesn't already have some form it comes in, but paper, wood, all these materials, thread, has some predetermined form. So there is something kind of unique about having to kind of go from amorphous material to form to then build from that. So it's one more step in the process. I think so much about what Tara's work is about is an engagement with the world, the materiality of the world that is already in front of us, and then playing with it, inverting it in a way that has us see it anew, and then recognize the kind of enormity of its mass production on this both beautiful level, this gorgeous aesthetic level, and then this also terrifying level of manufacture, like the pure production of and volume of manufacture that we're engaged in. So whereas, you know, and oh God, the last thing I wanted to be doing was talking about my work in any relationship to Tara Donovan. So that's a disclaimer, because I think just to make the distinction, I think for me what I'm interested in is constructing spaces that are psychological spaces that don't exist. So hell, paradise, home, you know, home-ish. And how do you make a space that exists in one's head? So it's a very different engagement in terms of a kind of starting with the word, the leaf, if you will, to build that nature. So I think our projects are quite different, which is why I think the process probably is slightly different too, and certain choices in materiality. But I think we probably also are trying to create something that you must walk in and get lost in, or be confronted by on a physical and imaginative scale. So I'd say that's similar, but this is, that's
great. So one thing that I think kind of connects this to this is something that Kim brought out in her opening remarks, and it relates to the title of the exhibition, Fieldwork, which is, the way we arrived at the title was twofold. One is that her works, whether they're sculptures and installations or even the works on paper, are very much suggestive of a landscape, of an environment. And the way that they occupy the space of the gallery is that they create an environment through which we move. And so they operate like a field, even though they are kind of somewhat bound and contained. But what I hadn't really thought about is how her works kind of take the architecture that they're sited in and make that a landscape. Do you know what I mean? Like they kind of the inversion is kind of more extensive than I had kind of put together. And so I'd like for us to talk a little bit about this idea of landscape and the way her works operate like one, even though they're sited within a building. And in fact, she's actually never made anything that lives outside in a landscape, even though many people have said to her, "Oh, you should do that, it'd be so easy." And she's like, "Really, thanks, I appreciate it. It's not like I haven't thought of it before." But yes, there is a natural kind of logic to her moving outside. But I think part of the strength of the work is that it feels like the outside is within the gallery when you're engaging with her work.
I don't know if anyone wants to respond.
I think it is very landscape-esque, and this is the illusion of landscape. That's the really amazing thing about it. It's the illusion of landscape, and it's the illusion of being. I think people have put wrongly the interpretation that she's an eco-artist and that she's doing, ecological work that is pointing to this mass overproduction that Kim was talking about, and yet she's using all those materials. And if the styrofoam gets ripped, she picks up another styrofoam cup, and so it's actually an abundance of materials, not a minimum of materials. And so I think that it's actually the antithesis of eco-sensitive, which I think is interesting because people want to attribute that to a woman often. That there's something about women are more sensitive to the environment. Women make public sculpture. Women care. Women nurture. Women save. And so I think that she's not doing that, and I think that she's resisting those impulses, and I think that the natural progression that Nora's suggesting of where she would go outdoors would actually be in that kind of big muscular Richard Serra, Marc de Souvreau sculpture park work, or what Lucy Lepard, who is a critic who is pro-environmentalist and is interested in sort of sensitivity and healing the world, used to call plop art. That it just was a public work that was plopped down. And that it had no regard for its actual environment. And that I think that actually is where Tara's work would have to go outside. She would become a plop artist in some way, in which there would be something of hers on a plaza that didn't necessarily relate to the environment around it.
Yeah, I use the word diorama in relation to the tar paper piece, and I feel like that's what she produces. Whether it's like the sort of shadow boxes of those index card pieces, or larger scale, that she isn't so much producing landscape art as these artificial dioramas.
They're like self-contained landscapes.
Exactly. We're talking about the Chicago Museum of Science and Technology, and these little installations where it's like for people like me who like their nature indoors.
I actually think
I'm very indoorsy.
okay, so I had this other little reverie because I was just kind of dreaming in her work for a while, and I thought, oh my God, this is a hoarder's interior world. This, right?
The beauty of the hoard.
Yeah, but a beautiful aestheticized hoarder. So there's this amazing Catalan artist, and he was a poet, and he did these theater pieces, and his name is Juan Brossa. And I loved, there was a picture in a catalog I saw once of his office, his home, and it was just, one of those little pathways, and on every side of the everything was covered with paper. So just stacks and stacks of paper everywhere. And interestingly, his last name Brossa is Catalan for waste paper basket, which is like, love that, so poetic. So there's a hoarder. I was actually, she's the opposite of eco. One of those eco artists. She is her best consumer, right? I mean, she's in that wonderful kind of, she's very clear about it, right? This is not it's not a political statement. I would agree. But the fact is, this notion of going outside, to me, the work has to live inside, in this interior world. It has to be this sort of collection, accumulation, and what it builds that is, as I say, evocative of a landscape, but it would lose all of that in going outside completely.
It also melts.
It would also probably fall apart. I mean, this is the thing, is that it's, these are like, it's also like poor minimalism in that it's very shabby materials that you can buy at the drugstore, that you can buy at Target, that you can pick up 1,000 safety pins or little push pins, and then she maximizes that by making them 1,000,000 instead of 1,000, and so you become drowned in your everyday materiality. So it's very banal in the sense that it's available to any of us to potentially make these, like this, the pins, these surfaces that, anybody could physically do that, maybe, if you had the time and inclination and the ability to do this gradient color with the pins. And I think that that's one of the really intensive qualities, is this subtlety of the gradient color that comes out. And for me, that's one of the nuances of her work that I really love, is that you get these subtle forms that the color is like a shapeshifter.
Well, Jenny, I'm super excited that you brought up the term poor art, because something that I'm shocked doesn't come up more in writing about Donovan's work is arte povera, is that movement and the way in which they, in ways that I feel are very similar to Donovan, sought to take shabby materials, shabby ordinary materials, and manipulate them in these very unheroic ways to produce kind of funny, enlightening installations and objects. I remember going through the MCA exhibition and thinking a lot about Giovanni Anselmo's work, and he did this piece that I always teach because it's just funny. Like my students here will acknowledge that I'm always like one of my big drums to beat is how funny minimalists are. Like I love the humor of minimalism. And I feel like it gets lost because when we think about minimalism today and post-minimalism, we think about these big self-important works by, again, Sarah or Smithson, Spiral Jetty, and we forget about like the really funny self-critical work that a lot of these artists were doing. And something that I love about arte povera is that they were very into kind of undermining the importance and the bigness of art. And Anselmo did this piece called Eating Sculpture or Eating Structure, which was basically just two pieces of granite that were tied together with I can't remember if it was a rubber band or with a string, and then in between, they were basically completely clamped together by putting a head of lettuce in between the two pieces of granite. And so you had to keep feeding the sculpture to keep it intact. So it was consuming, even though, the lettuce was just disintegrating. But the sculpture was constantly eating, and if you bought it, you had to keep feeding it to keep it alive. Like I feel like there's that kind of goofy comedy that's in a lot of Donovan's best work that doesn't get talked about a lot. I mean, that's a really extreme and kind of organic vision of this kind of minimalist comedy, but I feel like a lot of these pieces have a certain goofiness to them that goes overlooked just because of how magical the effect of their accumulation is.
There is such an interesting aspect. There is a sleight of hand kind of magic in her work. The kind of impossible, oh my God, that's done with this. The kind of visual, there's a visual, almost sleight of hand in the way that she works. So it's funny, going back both to when you were talking about the glam, but also the comedy of it, and then also what Nora was talking about, which was the pure pleasure of there is eye candy. There is a lot of eye candy. I mean, and it's funny because I think right now, I wonder if the sort of almost the entertainment value of her work, so that it pleases in this discovery, right, is also something that's going to become sort of much more, if you will, like required of us. Do you know what I mean? She's a performer. She's performing also in a really interesting and in the making, and then
so there's this danger that art can't just be itself and not there to entertain you.
I'm just sort of the looming sort of elephant in the room is Meow Wolf, actually. Basically, how is Meow Wolf going to change all the ways in which audience engages installation art experiences? Yeah, go for it.
So I think there's like 12 different ideas that I want to respond to, but one of them is I think that we can't mistake the like easily seducible material for, and even the joy and even the sheer kind of scale of her work, for those things are what you maybe like what first like excite and maybe engage you, But I think that we would be doing a disservice, and I know that no one's actually saying this, if we let that be the merit or the metric by which we evaluate. I know that that's not what we're doing, but I think that what's one of the more kind of important elements is to reconcile that she can do both.
Yes.
You know, that it's not, and something like, you know, Arta Povera, which I think of as being so important for introducing the idea of working with humble materials, that art doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be for the bourgeoisie or whatever, you know, that it can be of and from and for much broader audiences and makers. That there's like a little bit of a messiness to it, deliberately so, that hers very much jettisons. But that you can still use humble materials, and in large amounts, they no longer feel humble. That endowing them simply by just studying how they behave, not adding anything to them, not painting them, not cutting them, not glamming them, not, you know, manipulating them, other than by just accumulation, that is, you know, she has minimized, in a sense, her intervention, and that's what's so remarkable, is there's so much restraint embedded in that. I mean, there's so many materials where you're like, oh, well, if you just cut it, or if you just, you know, I mean, even the slinky, like, and we've all struggled with the slinky that gets knotted and like you can't untangle it, and she just like went for it. She's like, this is how they behave, this is what they do, like, let's just get a lot of them together and see what happens. And what happens is that you have that visceral response to your own experience with that object, and yet you can't believe that they can come together to form this thing. It's that you know all the steps that went into the making, and yet you still can't believe, A, that there's all the steps were performed, but B, that it could produce something that feels so unpredictable.
There's so much rigor in that work that is just, but I do think that the way in which audience is engaging the viewing, the expectation in viewing is changing. And it's just interesting in terms of how it also will potentially affect how the art's understood.
Can I say one last thing?
I also think, though, that it's okay to acknowledge that Tara Donovan is a market artist, and she sells well, and people like her work, and they want to buy it, and she makes renditions of things like this that are prints or lithographs that are expressly for the market, and they look beautiful in the museum, but they're still sellable objects. And I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with acknowledging that, and with the fact that, you know, we are in the biggest selfie culture possible, where people go to museums and want to see big installations so that they can shove their head in front of it and take a picture and post it on Instagram. And, you know, I would wager if we you know, Googled the show and hit images, that there's a whole lot of selfie culture that's going on.
No,
It's
extraordinary.
It's the MCA Denver. And that's another aspect of when you say people use this show differently, there's different, you know, it doesn't change that it can be a rigorous process-based show for some people, but if you're 12 and under, or, you know, this is where you want to be, is like in front of the shiny, you know, fun objects, the Mylar. And you put yourself into, you insert yourself into the frame, which I think is an interesting problem of, with all that restraint, that gets ruined by the fact that somebody's like, you know, grinning in front of it.
And it's true, the most Instagrammed work from the exhibition is the big Mylar one. And part of it is that everyone encounters that work coming from the more subdued gallery with the composition card works. And so there's like a double layer of shock, kind of, that people experience, and I think that's what they take to. But we had no idea. We thought that it was going to be the index card sculpture that was going to be the selfie background. What do we know? But the thing that's really remarkable, and I'll just kind of leave this out there and then we'll open it up, is that so many people have come to the exhibition, you know, photograph themselves or photograph just the work, and they feel so much pride almost in sharing it with the world. Like, I'm so cool that I saw this cool thing and now here I am with this cool thing and you're gonna think I'm cool because I'm with this cool thing. You know, there's like self-promotional aspect to it, which has been very interesting. Okay, why don't we open it up to some questions from the audience?
So I wanted to kind of ask a question sort of about what you were saying, her restraint with the materials that she chooses and that she's not manipulating them at all, just using that accumulation. But I do think she has a big eye to presentation, that like there are some things to know about the pieces, like the index cards aren't actually index cards, they're like an archival material. The fact that those stacks don't have any interior, that they have.
That's not true. They have an interior.
Right, they have an armature, correct? So it's not through and through just a stack of index cards. So your past discussion with her, she was talking about the straw piece and how when she first made it, it literally was just a stack of straws, but in iterations of that, she's decided to fix some of the pieces so that it doesn't fall down. Right? So like the final presentation of the object is more important than staying completely true to that idea of accumulation or staying true to the physical properties of the material.
That's a great comment and question. And what I would say is that when Tara is developing a work, she's, playing with it, studying it, experimenting a lot, lots of trial and error. And for example, with the index cards, she first started out using kind of, the lined paper-based index cards that we all used to use. And just seeing kind of how that would behave, how it reacts, how it performs in a sense on its own. And she saw what it was capable of doing, but she knew that for the long-term preservation of the work, this was not a durable material. And that's how she kind of pivoted to the polystyrene card that she ended up using. So to me, that doesn't feel incompatible with her kind of material specificity, because she had landed on what that material does and how she was going to exploit that. And she identified a kind of more durable alternative for it. In terms of the drinking straws, I would say it's kind of the same thing, because it's not so much about caring about like the image of the work in its final presentation, in terms of her use of glue now to keep it steady. It's just that the work can't, she again knew because of the first time of installing it without any adhesive or anything to kind of keep its structure intact. It didn't stay intact. And so there needed to be something that could secure it and stabilize it. And so I don't feel like that is contradictory to letting the materials behave as they want to behave, because there would be no art almost. There would be no work if she let that. So it's kind of like finding a way to, I get your point that it feels like, is it more important to have the like impression that this work is supporting itself rather than literally the work supporting itself? And I don't think that that's the case. I think the work, at least a third of it is just stacked and is not glued. That's getting into the weeds. The point is that I think she had realized the work in its fullest potential, and now having done that, she recognizes that it won't last. And as an artist, I think that is part, like the preservation of the art is like another thing to have to kind of contend with. And so that's how she kind of came to finding these ways to support it. So sorry for the long-winded.
For me, like when you were talking about the heroism, like part of why for me I can kind of see both ways, but it doesn't feel heroic in the same way as like James Sarah, because you can imagine making it or you can see all of the labor. I was wondering if you could
I will say one thing and then I'll pass the mic down, which is that Tara has this great quote where she says, "My work is made of a mechanized process without the luxury of a machine." And that is in many ways that kind of straddles both sides to this heroism debate, because you know that it's handmade, which somehow feels anti-heroic or unheroic, versus like a Sarah, which is produced in a foundry and, you know, requires a labor of a different kind of skilled labor and expertise that Tara's work, because it's just ripping and stacking tar paper, doesn't seem to imply, but the discipline to keep doing it and to stay committed to that project while you're in it is an enormous effort, and one that I don't think I was fully aware of until I actually had to be a part of it.
Well, so that's why I had to say, I sort of started when you said it didn't come off as heroic to you, because and I think both Jenny and I were like, why not? And you know, this is really illuminating this sort of notion of labor as being actually that the idea of seen labor makes something less heroic potentially than sort of a manufacture that happens at a scale that is out of human hands, right? Larger than what, you know, a single human or a series of handmade things could produce, connotes heroicism. Is a really interesting flip and something I think we have to really challenge. I mean, it's just fun.
I think so I have been to Tara's studio. Nora's been there many more times than I have. I've just been there once, but it was very striking to see what I, in effect, see her as working on the scale of a man. The way male sculptors of an earlier generation were able to do by having many, many assistants. So she has a big warehouse space. She has about 8 people working for her at any one time, full time. She's not doing this labor alone. She's outsourcing the production of it. And I think that that's one of these important things to recognize, is that we are in a space in the art world where it is okay, if you can afford to outsource your production. You come up with the idea, but somebody else is actually fabricating the work. And that becomes then, I think, that the labor force that produces that is paid and has chosen to do that work, but is the sort of the fine line that many people walk between skilled and unskilled labor. Is that if you are a skilled practitioner, sometimes you can end up in somebody else's studio because you have a skill set and you end up subsuming your skill to their presentation, and it has nothing anymore to do with your work, and you have to produce your work on the side. And so there becomes these degrees or this level or hierarchy, we might say, about skill in the art world that I find fascinating as a problem of who's able to afford to outsource their work, who can afford help, who can afford labor, who can only do it if they have a grant once and then they hire a studio assistant, you know, for a couple of hours a week or something. And many people at certain points in their career often hire or have art students come work. It's a really gratifying experience to be a studio assistant. I did it as an art student myself. It's really important, I think, to have the experience of working in somebody's studio, paid or unpaid, to see how a professional artist behaves and works, and that you realize that half of what they do is answer emails, and you know, maybe outsourcing the email is the best part so that they can go make their work. But you know, that it's something for all, I think, young art students to experience, so that you can see what that's like. And I think that labor, though, what you're talking about, is this really big can of worms to talk about what kind of labor, whose labor, and all that.
Well, and if I can add to my sense of the like anti-heroicism of this, I do want to stress that it's comes from a place, again, of her sources, right? Minimalist and post-minimalist artists who at a certain point took great pride in a kind of stereotypically masculine definition of what constituted heroism, which was big, heavy, mechanical. And so I want to stress that's because as someone who writes about feminism in craft, like I find Elaine Rychek's needlepoints tremendously heroic. But I also understand that in the way that we tend to culturally interpret heroism in art, as far as things like scale and monumentality, of not just the object, but of its making and of the tools of its making, that we tend not to think in those terms. So I did want to clarify.
I'm glad you, yeah. And there was a question.
Thank you, everyone here. It's been so interesting to hear all of your various points of view here, and also like the disagreement. It's really interesting. So I wanted to go back to the first question, which is about this, about the materials. And I confess I didn't really know the artist's work before I went to the exhibition. One friend of mine was like, "Oh, she's that artist that works in trash," and then I read the, because I am working with an artist who works in trash, and which I'm kind of trying to decide is like debris, I guess. But so I went onto the website and it was like, the mundane becomes sublime. I was like, oh, this is gonna be really cool. So I went and I felt like, so this isn't to go to Donovan's intentions or her practice, but maybe the way that we talk about it. And so I'm one of these, so I'm a curator, an art historian that's really interested in like truth and accuracy. Like that's the most important thing. And this has to do with because I come from an area that's like really misrepresented in the field of art history. And so I felt like when I was going through it, I had the expectation of the mundane, the index card, and I looked at it and I was like, well, I don't know, there's no lines on this. This couldn't possibly be an index card. And the straws, I was like, well, those aren't really straws like we use. I don't know where she's finding these straws, but this isn't like the white straw with the red stripe or the green straw. And so I feel like it might be interesting to think about talking about her in like, where does she make that shift from moving from the index card into sculptural paper of a certain dimension or something like that, that she is not actually using the mundane anymore. It might be an interesting way to sort of think about what she's doing. So for example, I think I read this right, and I remember it correctly, is the gold mylar straws, that window portal piece. Those aren't straws, those are like wrapped, bound mylar, right?
She made them into straw-like forms. I don't think that they're not straws. They're
Right.
pieces of mylar that were rolled.
And so that to me is, added like a whole other layer, and that was maybe one of the first pieces I encountered. And so it was like, oh, she's not just using the mundane, where mylar, like someone had said earlier, mylar is not exactly a mundane. I would also say like straight pins aren't mundane to most people because they don't make anything with them. But I thought that part, like maybe we changed that dialogue around her materials.
I like that.
I will say that the tar paper was purchased at Home Depot, and it was 120 rolls that we used, and I don't know if there's nothing more mundane in a sense than that. I think that the language around her work, there's absolutely a difference and a distinction between trash, which implies that something has been used and then it's being repurposed or recycled, and that's definitely not the oh, okay.
I think that was a misrepresentation of my friend too.
Oh.
I don't take that
Okay.
into account with anything.
I see.
Yeah.
The drinking straws are drinking straws that she orders from one manufacturer. They're not specially made for her. She doesn't craft them. She doesn't design them. They're just what's found. The mylar she found at a it's not a party goods store, but it's a store in Connecticut that has a lot of kind of I want to say like craftier kind of materials. So I think the language is really about emphasizing that these aren't precious materials. These aren't items that have a lot of value in and of themselves, that they exist because they're in service of some action or activity that our body typically needs or requires in some way or uses in some way, and that is their defining feature. So, I mean, I guess a slinky is a toy, something to be played with, so maybe that puts it in a different category, but glue, pencil, button, drinking cup, of a couple of different varieties, all of those things exist because they are in service of our bodies. They aren't in and of themselves, they don't have a lot of importance. We don't assign a lot of value to them. And part of her enterprise is to resuscitate them and kind of exploit a kind of inherent value that they actually do have that we overlook.
Just a quick thing. I mean, I can completely understand where in the index card piece and then the gold mylar that the referent is there, like the referent and the scale and quality and proportion. So you kind of, understand those initial investigations were probably happening with very much the original, right? And then in imagining the potential of this multiplied into these sorts of accretions or what have you, that then the thing becomes the referent rather than necessarily the individual object, so I think that just both in terms of the rolled mylar and but I think that's the sort of creative act of sort of, what this structure could be and become, that we also have a referent for, but it doesn't, interesting thing about art is there's a lot of artifice, right? What is real? There's a lot of suspension of disbelief that artists engage and have to engage in to sort of get to where they're going. So truth is a tricky one to expect from art. Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. There's something there. That's a longer conversation. It's like, and I understand where it's coming from.
I also think it'd be really interesting to think about how her work wouldn't look like if you remade a lot of this work using bright matte colors. It would start to look like advertising, and it would lose all the qualities of that sort of translucence or the neither here nor there, the luminosity, all of the light catching avenues that she's actually working through. She's really using light. Light is actually one of the primary materials in her work. It's just not, it's not a listed, thank you. It's not a listed material. But if you took this button piece and you made this out of like pink and turquoise buttons, it'd be ugly and awful. And it wouldn't look like it would be something that you would find in a toy store. It wouldn't be this, beautiful luminous thing that looks like a sea anemone, or anemone, is that how you say it? It wouldn't have that kind of floating quality. And I think that the light is actually one of the primary materials in which she's actually working.
And that's where you get the color, actually, is the way the material.
Just to conclude that point, that's where you get any color, however fugitive it might be, is from the way that the material interacts with light. I mean, it's a kind of chemical production.
I had my children yesterday at the MOA for the Natura Obscura, which is you walk through and it's an immersive experience. We're walking through with black lights and it was lovely and it was artistic, and I love the accessibility of the materials that make people feel like they can go home and be part of it and become artists themselves and maybe find a way to express something. I think contemporary art has the potential to take people from outside the art community who don't think of themselves as creatives at all and just expose them to ideas, political ideas, new social norms. How do we move from this new entertainment aspect that's going on? Because for me, I'm hoping now next time I say, hey, let's go to the MOA, and I want to look at something stationary, that they'll say, okay, because I took them to something else. So how do we use these things as a conduit to pieces that are meant to maybe make more of a statement that is political or that is social?
As the museum representative, I will happily respond. I mean, I think all that, I'm also a parent, so I can relate in many ways, which is that you just want to encourage, and it's not just younger people, I think our peers as well, you know, it's just about conditioning people to be more open-minded, and not having a set of rules that condition the experience a priori. So, you know, my kids, I bring them to, we call it my museum. I know it's not mine, but call it my museum all the time. And what do they love to do? Ride the elevator and like run up the ramp. And I don't care because I want them to love going to a museum. We talk about, you know, we use our walking feet and whatever it is, but my kids are very young, sorry, to like foreground that. They're not like 13 years old. But my point is that if you brought people, friends, peers, children to an installation and they had a meaningful experience there, there's nothing to say that meaningful experience had to do with the spectacle of what they saw or what they experienced or what they moved through. It could have been I mean, there are so many different ways, and so you don't have to replicate the exact same thing, obviously. It's about saying, you know, you had this really cool, you know, we had this really great afternoon. Your eyes were opened up in this way, and you seemed you were like really jazzed by it. Let's go do this again, and there's going to be completely new work. Maybe we'll be jazzed by it, maybe we won't, but let's try it. And I think it's just the attitude of openness that, and I think, I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I think contemporary art constantly rewards that and helps you. I mean, the reason why I value artists so much is that they help us to understand aspects of our world that we struggle with, whether that's political, social, aesthetic, what have you. And if we don't have artists putting that out into the world, how are we ever going to kind of adapt and consider from different these issues from different perspectives? So I think that the way that you kind of get to that big idea is just through like very small, low impact openings, and make them repeated, and that kind of habituating young people or anyone to that, I think just kind of sows the seeds from which a lot of really exciting things can grow.
I'll just say very quickly that I think, so I work with a lot of first-generation college students, and many of whom have never been to a museum until they've taken an art history class and are forced to go for an assignment. And we've spent a lot of time in my classes talking about what constitutes, there's a lot of confusion often about galleries versus museums, and the fact that they're always very surprised that museums don't sell work and that there's only one of that thing on the wall, and that it's an original, or what the idea of the original is like a big concept. I think that's really also rewarding to think about, is that you can't see this thing in any other place. This is the place, and then you start to associate it with that city, and you can come back and visit it, or it might always be up there because it's part of the permanent collection. And I think that that's actually the challenge of working in a space like the MCA here, is that there is no, I know you have a collection, but there's no, or you don't have any collection, but there's no real collection to work with, and that everything that you see will always be new and different each time, because it's a brand new show. You're bringing in a very contemporary artist who's making a body of work often for that particular space, and that's a very different than going to the Denver Museum of Art and seeing the same objects over and over again that are very beloved, that you see from the time maybe you're small to the time you're a teenager, if you grow up in that city, so it's a very different thing. What disturbs me is this new concept of the selfie museum. I mentioned selfies before, but there is this thing called like the Museum of Ice Cream, if some of you have seen this thing that's trucking around the country, and the fact that it's literally just these big, I don't know, mise-en-scenes or tableaus of backdrops where you can take pictures of yourself like you're in an ice cream, like in a thing of sprinkles or something, or whipped cream, and that it's trying to sell that immersive experience that contemporary art is also has had real traction in doing for a long time, and that now these are it's like a competing sort of idea or institution just based on making money and building these props that you can go interact with for 5 minutes. And that's what sort of disturbs me, is this sort of false museum. So if we're talking actually about truth and accuracy, that to me becomes, it calls itself a museum, it bills itself as a museum, and yet it's not really a museum, it's just a for-profit set of backdrops that's candy colored, and I think you can buy ice cream on the way out, but it's like $25 to walk into, and people line up all over to do this, and they bring it city to city so that you can have this selfie quality on the way out of it.
I think the tricky part is when you have something like a Kusama Infinity Room or the Rain Room or a Team Lab installation that is basically, to most people, the exact same experience as going to Candytopia or Museum of Ice Cream or any of these, where people are going not to actually be present in the thing, but merely to document that they were there and share it with the world. That's the completion or fulfillment of the work of art almost.
In this exhibition, the references to a scientific process and aesthetic were really obvious to me, and that kind of came up in the conversation about how heroic this work is, and in dealing with that aesthetic, I feel like she kind of sidestepped this like gendered conversation of heroism and is trying to like execute these materials testing experiments. It feels like I'm at Boeing seeing how much stress this metal can take or something. And walking through the rooms was like, you're getting to witness these experiments in process. So I'm curious about the language about science with this exhibition and your thoughts on that.
My husband's an engineer, and he was super into it for very different reasons than I was. And it had a lot to do with like the quiet ways in which he was testing the materials. In particular, he was really impressed with that floor piece of the test tubes, I believe they are.
They're plastic tubes.
The shipping tubes, right? The translucent shipping tubes on the Korean platforms. He was really interested in that because he uses stuff like that for his job, and was mostly interested in how they were cut and laid and the way that the light hit them. I mean, going back to this idea of light being the unspoken medium in which he's working, while I was thinking, oh, these are so much like Robert Irwin, and he's bending light and material and all that kind of thing. And so yeah, I feel like I had an unexpected experience with that, as well as the fact that my husband and I both come from really working class backgrounds, and he grew up doing construction and roofing, and so he was experiencing the tar paper and the nail pieces very differently than I was, where I was just kind of dazzled by the surfaces and the edges and whatnot.
I think the scientific process and the artistic process are actually quite compatible, and I think there is a wonderful kind of laboratory aspect to her work and to certain rooms, or sort of, okay, what will happen if we accumulate it in this way, in that way, and I think that's there's something deeply satisfying about seeing the range of experimentation, right, in service to a question or a proposition that we don't really know, right, so what's being tested, but yet we infer, this sort of overarching theory at hand, and I think I sort of love the way in which there's an exhaustive quality to her engagement with these different materials in a kind of commitment. When I say exhaustive, it's like really kind of, let's try it this way, and what happens when we do it here, and I think in the end, the test is sort of perhaps visual in the sense, sort of visceral and aesthetic, and that's beautiful, and that's okay. I mean, and that's meaningful in its way. But I do think that there's sort of a very kind of incredible commitment that happens. That's evident in this show and all of her work. So that's all.
I think that's a really good point that you're bringing up about science, and that it's her work, the testing, and also the exhaustive, what you're saying, the exhaustive quality of working the material till it almost collapses or until you collapse, one or the other. And some people find that endlessly fascinating, and other people find it very boring. And so it's like one or the other. And then also like the idea of, it reminds me a lot of actually photography and the idea of trying to fix an experience. You make soap bubbles, and then you literally try to fix them to the page, and that doesn't work. So she's making work that is trying to fix that unfixable experience in some way, and she's doing it through these very resonant, translucent, difficult to work with materials that are often plastics or foam or highly manufactured, and yet give us the illusion and let light transfer or pass through, which is very scientific and really does have a relationship. I mean, the irony is I think her work is very difficult to photograph as a result, even though it's got this quality of having light as one of the primary materials, which is obviously also embedded in the history of photography, is that we're trying to fix the image through our own relationship to light.
Maybe one more question.
You mentioned briefly that at some point she stopped titling her work, and I was curious when that happened. And one of the things that maybe I missed at the exhibit, I wasn't familiar with her work before I went, but one of the things maybe I missed was an artist's statement, and I was curious whether that's commonplace for contemporary artists who are doing retrospective, like you're supposed to kind of get it from walking through, or I mean, from my perspective, I really wanted to know, from my perspective coming at it from art is communication, I really wanted to know if I was getting it. And you know what I mean? Like I was like, well, what does she intend? Because you can see all this stuff and you can bring whatever to the exhibit. And so I'm curious to know.
Sure.
How much
Okay,
that was
so
intentional.
to answer your first question, I think she stopped titling her works in about 2004. And really the impetus was that she didn't want to direct anyone to have a particular type of experience with her work. She wanted it to be as open and unfiltered as possible. To get to your other question, we don't typically in a museum issue or produce an artist statement. The benefit of having your work shown in a museum is that you get this curatorial kind of lens on the work. And so what we did is we produced a gallery guide, which I'm not sure if you found, but in that it talks about the works. There's also an excerpt from an interview that Tara and I did that we included in it, so that her voice was kind of more integrated into just the material that we were providing. And in fact, it was funny because somebody recently visited the exhibition and he was really pissed that we didn't have labels on the wall. And that was a concession that I made to Tara, because she was very insistent that the walls be totally clean, the galleries be completely clean. And given that the entire building was dedicated to her work, it felt like we could just put it all in the gallery guide, and that was kind of sufficient enough in terms of providing information. But this guy's a friend of mine. He's like, your gallery attendants are so well trained. They knew everything. He's like, but I was like, where's the label? And so we were a little more kind of open in that. But I think that, if you're in a gallery show, I think it's, probably more common practice for an artist to kind of control the frame within which
the work is being shown, and in that sense, an artist statement sometimes accommodates a gallery show, but in a museum, it's less rare. It's more rare. Okay, you have been such a fantastic audience, full of so many wonderful questions. Thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing your attention and your thoughtfulness and your curiosity. The exhibition is open for like 12 more hours, so we're open extended hours tomorrow. And to my amazing, brilliant panelists, thank you for sharing your ideas and your perspectives. And I know that Tara is so honored as well to have your voices contribute to the conversation around her work. So thank you all so much.